Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guest is Yuval ben Bassat. Yuval, together with Johann Busseow, is the author of Late Ottoman Gaza, an Eastern Mediterranean hub in transformation, a book that was published by Cambridge University Press in 2024. In contemporary public discourse, Gaza tends to be characterized mostly as a theater of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians at large. However, little is known about Gaza's society, politics, economy, and culture during the Ottoman era, and particularly during the late Ottoman period. So, drawing on a range of previously untapped local and imperial sources, both Yuval and Johann have explored the city's history from the mid-19th century throughout World War I, and they have shown that Gaza's historical importance extends far beyond the territory of the Strip, since the city was an important hub for people, goods, and ideas in the whole Eastern Mediterranean, well, from antiquity until the 20th century. Yuval and Johann have introduced the readers to the world of Gazans from various walks of life, from the traditional Muslim elites to the commoners and minority communities of Christian and Jews. And in so doing, they have told and tell the lively story of this significant but frequently misunderstood city. But before we delve into all of this, first things first, Yuval, welcome.
Thank you, Roberto.
Now, Johann is not with us today, but I want to start asking some basic information. So if you can tell us something about yourself, and also about the origins of the book.
Okay, I'm a historian of the modern Middle East, focusing on 19th century Ottoman Palestine and the greater region of Greater Syria. I graduated from the University of Chicago in 2007, and since then I'm working on this region. I wrote a book on petitions submitted from the District of Jerusalem to Istanbul. I work on Ottoman petitions, on maps, Ottoman maps, on a little bit on World War I in the region, the early Zionist Arab encounter, stuff like this. And it's a project that Johann, Professor Busseow, and I are working on for about a decade. It started in 2014, but the cooperation between us actually goes back even deeper and goes back to a conference in Jerusalem, 2008, a century for the since the Young Turk era. And we met there in this conference in Yad Ben Tzvi in 2008. And since then, we've been working together. We published a book together, an edited book, a lot of articles, a lot of other publications, and also some grants. And it's a very productive cooperation. We meet twice or three times a year. We discuss our issues almost weekly. And it's a very positive, very good experience for both of us. We're actually very good friends. And this is the last product of our cooperation, this book on late Ottoman Gaza.
Now, you said that you started a long time ago, working on this project. Yet, writing today about Gaza takes the readers immediately to the contemporary situation. So can you tell us how did the process of writing, particularly in the last stages of writing this book, which covers the late Ottoman era, has been affected by current events?
So first of all, we write about a region that we cannot visit. Even before October 7th, we couldn't visit Gaza. Actually, we could hardly talk to Gazans or correspond with Gazans. It was a bit risky for them. We did have some cooperation through Germany. We did have some cooperation with Gazan scholars, but it was very difficult, and at times we had to stop the correspondence for a while. So it was anyway difficult. It's of course it became much more difficult after October 7th. We handed in the manuscript a little bit before October 7th, and then we decided not to update it. We decided that it's an historical work and we want to keep it this way. We didn't update it. We didn't refer to the events. It took about a year and a half to prepare the book for publication due to some technical difficulties, mainly at the CUP. And so we decided to leave it this way and to keep it at the historical level.
Now, let's talk about Gaza. You are using a view from Jabal al-Muntar, which is a hill east of Gaza, to describe how the city would have looked like in the 19th century. And I think this is a great way to start the book, to be honest. Can you talk about how the city actually looked like in this period of time, and which sources are available to study late Ottoman Gaza?
Okay, so if one stood at Jabal al-Muntar, east of Gaza, it's a hill. It's basically the highest hill in the region. One would, of course, see the Mediterranean Sea to its west, and then he would see a range of dunes, very high dunes, which actually separated the city from the Mediterranean. So unlike conventional wisdom, Gaza at the end of the Ottoman period was not a port city. It was actually 3-4 kilometers inland, and this range of dunes separated the city from the sea. It was located next to an ancient road, next to the Via Maris or Tariq al-Sultan, which led from Cairo to Damascus, and actually divided the city into two. And that's very important for our later discussion, because we have on one side, east of the road, we have Sajaiya, and west of the road, we have Daraj, Zaytun, the old city, and that's important. We will remember it for the time being. One would see Gaza basically as an oasis. You have the dunes around it, and there is vast agricultural land around the city. It was actually very beautiful, according to the pictures. Agricultural land, very developed. Dozens of villages around, 60 villages in the sub-district of Gaza at the end of the Ottoman period, and that's basically the hinterland of the city. The city was very important for the villages around it. And one would also see some differences between Sajaiya on the one side, that was built from mud brick construction and was very gray, and then the stone houses in the middle of the city, which were more white. And that's even in pictures or in paintings that we have, one really sees this difference between the two parts of the city. So the main source that we used was the census of 1905, the Ottoman census of Gaza. It's available online. It's located at the Israel State Archives in Jerusalem. And basically, we constructed a database, which is called Gaza Historical Database. And it contains some 20,000 people from Gaza at the end of the Ottoman period. Some registers were lost. So we know that it's not complete. We know that the population was actually a bit larger, probably 25,000 people, but we cannot find those lost registers to date. We also used a lot of materials from the Başbakanlık Osmanlı Arşivi in Istanbul. We used petitions. We used Ottoman correspondence, memorandums, sorry. We used the Sharia court records. We have them for only 4 years, between 1857 and 1861. They're available in Istanbul. We used several manuscripts in Arabic, especially one by Ahmed Busseow from 1897, which is called Kashf el-Niqab. It's a manuscript from Gaza that we were able to get. It was not published. We used a compilation of 4 volumes by Osman el-Taba, Ithaf el-Aiza. That's a very important source by someone who actually lived in Gaza at the time, and this compilation was published in 1999 in Gaza, and it's a very important source about the city. We used the newspapers in several languages, diaries, memoirs in Hebrew that we found and are really relevant for our discussion, and a lot of maps and aerial photos. So altogether, it's a very rich collection, which allows rethinking about Gaza, and for the first time actually publishing a manuscript in English about the city at the end of the Ottoman period. To date, we didn't have anything like this, and thankfully there is another manuscript which will appear apparently next year by Dotana Levi. So it's a growing library, a growing literature about late Ottoman Gaza that is now appearing.
So I want to go back to the context after this overview. And I was wondering if you can place Gaza in both the local and larger environments, and also comparing Gaza with other cities, because obviously Gaza is by the sea, is not far away from Jaffa, and is at a bit of a distance from Jerusalem, but they're all connected, and then also connected with the newly created Ottoman city of Beersheba.
Right. So as I said, the first thing to remember is that it's not a port city. We learned in our analysis that in terms of the politics, Gaza behaves much more like an inner city, like a trade city, Damascus, Jerusalem, Nablus, very stormy politics, coalitions struggling with each other. It behaves much less than, it doesn't behave like port cities like Beirut, Haifa, Jaffa, cities with growing European intervention at the end of the 19th century, a lot of settlers who settled in and around the city, a lot of modernization, a lot of new modas, development. So we don't have all of this in Gaza at the time that we are discussing. Gaza, to a large extent, played by its own rules. We will talk about it later. The economy was based on caravan trade until 1869, until the Suez Canal was open, and then overnight, basically, the land trade became obsolete and collapsed. But Gaza basically reinvented itself. It had, as I said, a very large agricultural hinterland, which was very important for the city and also for the villagers. For a while, it benefited a lot from export of barley mainly to England, barley grown in the northern Negev, through Gaza's little port, a port that was 4 kilometers west of the city. And as I said, Gaza, as you mentioned, Gaza had very strong connections with Beersheba, with the region of Beersheba, with the Bedouins there. And that was one of the reasons that the Ottomans decided in 1900 to disconnect the region of Beersheba from Gaza, because they didn't like the involvement or influence of the Gazan elite over the Bedouins in the Negev. It was not the only reason, but it was one of the reasons.
Now, given Gaza's position, can you speak with more details about the so-called Egyptian factor? I mean, we have to remember that essentially Gaza is the last city before getting into the Sinai Peninsula, so the desert, and then reach, by land Egypt. How did the relationship with the Khedival Egypt influence the development of Gaza?
So the connections between Gaza and Egypt were very strong. We were actually surprised by that factor. First of all, visitors who visited Gaza at the time often described it as a little Egyptian town. Really, it resembled, in their eyes, it looked more like an Egyptian town, maybe El Arish, maybe other locations, than a Palestinian place compared, let's say, to Jaffa or other places. Most of the elite of Gaza, the religious elite, most of it studied in Al Azhar. We have very strong connections there. They maintained very strong connections with the Khedive of Egypt. Something that Abdul Hamid, the Sultan at the time, really didn't like. So he was very suspicious about those connections, and the Gazan elite actually played this card. I mean, it's something that we see very often, that the Gazans, notables from Gaza, approach the Khedive and ask for his intervention in various issues, and the Sultan really didn't like it. He saw it very negatively. We also see the settlement of a lot of Egyptians in Gaza and around Gaza, something that always existed, but apparently since the occupation of Palestine by Ibrahim Pasha in the 30s, gained momentum and continued later on. And according to the census, we can estimate that about 10% of the population in Gaza had some Egyptian background. That's a lot, and that's a very important factor. But the more important issue, other than the population, is that there was a lot of suspicion by the Ottoman side about those connections between Gaza and Egypt. And I think one of the reasons that Sultan Abdul Hamid eventually banished the leadership of the Husseini family from Gaza in 1898 was his suspicion about those connections, and the fear that those connections will be a pretext or will enhance British aspirations to take over this region. So Gaza is next to the Egyptian border. It has very strong connections with Egypt, and there's a lot of suspicion, a lot of rumors, a lot of there's a talk about about conspiracies, about some plans for British takeover of this region, and of course, someone like Abdul Hamid, for him, it's really a pretext for intervention and for banishing, for example, the Husseini family.
I want to talk about living in Gaza. And again, perhaps for the listeners, it's hard, and for everybody really, to disassociate the images of Gaza today, completely destroyed, and try to go back in time and think about the living built up of Gaza. So perhaps we need to wear, all of us historian hats, and so remove those images. Can you give us a sense of the neighborhoods of Gaza, the structure and functioning?
Right. So at face level, we have four neighborhoods in Gaza. That's Sujaiya that I mentioned, Tufah, a very small neighborhood, Zaytun and Daraj, the more affluent neighborhoods, Zaytun and Daraj. These are the neighborhoods that we find in the Ottoman census of 1905. These are the official neighborhoods according to which the census was conducted at that time. But what we learned from our work is that there were many more kinds of neighborhoods, some of them official, some of them less official, but socially or geographically quite well defined. So neighborhoods were really important in the urban life of Gaza. Everything evolved around those neighborhoods. And what we find in the research is that neighborhoods were politicized entities. Basically, they were the center of activity in Gaza, political mobilization, faction building, which was really important in Gaza, was based on the neighborhood level. For example, we learned it by looking at those who signed petitions in support of specific coalition or specific politicians. We will talk about the Husseinis and their rivals in a minute. We also learned that there was a formalized character of neighborhoods as an administrative unit. We learned it from several examples. For example, we see names of Mukhtars in the census, which appear in the census. In one place, we also find in the census someone who is called the neighborhood scribe, Machale Katibi. And that basically suggests that there were some sort of permanent neighborhood administration in Gaza. Neighborhoods are also mentioned in marriage registers that we have from 1905. And it's really interesting to see that people from some neighborhoods prefer to marry with people from certain neighborhoods, but avoid marrying people from other neighborhoods. For example, we will not find, or maybe just a few cases of marriages between Sujaiya, which was a poor neighborhood, rural poor neighborhood, and the Daraj, the more affluent neighborhood. But we do find a lot of cases of marriages within Daraj or marriages between Daraj and Zaytun, and that's very important. Also, the whole layout of the city was oriented towards trade. As I said, it was a trade city, big access arteries. There are no gates to the neighborhoods. We don't have any labyrinth of small alleys like in Jerusalem or in other places. It's an open city, no walls since the Mamluk period at least. So it's a city geared towards trade. It is located on an intersection of several important trade routes, especially the Via Maris that I mentioned, but also roads going inland toward Beersheba, towards Hebron, towards northern Sinai. And that's basically what we can say about the city, the neighborhoods. Yeah.
Now, there's a part of the book which I really, really enjoyed reading, and I think you've done an amazing job looking at the jobs performed by Gazans. Can you share with us your findings? I mean, can you give us a sense of what were the occupations of Gazans?
So basically, thanks to the census, we can really tabulate, we can really learn about the various occupations in Gaza. It allows close examination of the work market in Gaza. For example, we learned that Sujaiya is a very rural neighborhood. Almost everybody is working in agriculture or occupations that are related to agriculture. We have very few white-collar workers. We have very few people with honorific titles, religious or Ottoman honorific titles. On the other hand, we see that Daraj and Zaytun, those two neighborhoods, we have very few agricultural workers there. We have much more upscale white-collar positions, if you can call it. A lot of governmental works. We have a lot of merchants, traders. We have many more people with religious titles and Ottoman honorary titles. So we can learn about the differences between the different neighborhoods. But we also learned from the 1905 census that Gaza was still a trade caravan city. Trade was very important, very prominent in the job market in Gaza, probably also related to the barley trade that I mentioned earlier. And also a lot of jobs related to the agriculture hinterland in the city and around the city. The agricultural sector, both in the city, some sections of Gaza were really rural, and of course around the city. We can assume that thousands of people moved daily between Gaza and the fields around it to work there. So it's basically a community based on agriculture and trade.
And I think this is very interesting because, again, the perception is always that Gaza is a port city, is a city on the sea. But really, all of the data suggests it was something different. And while I was reading the book, I also remember a previous book by Salim Tamari, Mountains Against the Sea. And again, that was like the beginning of understanding that not necessarily the geographical location makes up for, the certains of what people are doing in the city itself. So I found that chapter extremely interesting.
With this definition of mountain, or this concept of mountain against the sea, we think that Gaza behaves much more like the mountain, although it's very close to the sea.
And later in the chapter, you're discussing then the sub-neighborhood level. And I was wondering, what does this analysis tell us about Gaza?
We learned about the importance of small, unofficial, or informal neighborhoods. We learned about the open structure of the city. As I said, it's geared toward the traffic, towards the routes that are intersecting in Gaza. As I said, no closed neighborhoods like in Jerusalem or other places. No gates to the neighborhoods, no city walls, at least since the Mamluk period. We also, that's very interesting, we also find some hints or some clues to social formations that even today are relevant for our discussion. I'll give one example. That's the Hilis clan. We find it, we hear about it in the news until a few years ago. One would hear it as a militant group in Gaza that is opposing Hamas, the Hamas government. And we find during the late Ottoman period, we find that this group settled in a compact road or way along one small street in Sujaiya, which was known as the Hilis Street. We learned about it. We find actually this name in a map from the Mandate period. But we also have a manuscript by Ahmed Busseow, which I mentioned earlier, and he gives some very negative or biased comments about this group. And basically he's saying that they are very unruly, nobody can control them. And as we see until today, they're very free-minded people with opposition to Hamas in this case.
And let me ask, if I think about Jerusalem, for instance, in the same period of time, neighborhood boundaries not necessarily corresponded to social ones. Is it the same in Gaza?
That's very interesting. The census allows us to examine the social backgrounds of various families in specific neighborhoods. And although we don't have a map which really shows us where each house is located, a map that will accompany the census, we can still locate quite a lot of houses, especially the big mansions, the huge mansions that were owned by elite or by notable families. And what we see is like a mixture, a very interesting mixtures that we see in Gaza, in affluent neighborhoods like Daraj and Zaytun. We would see mansions, huge mansions of elite families, and next to them, really small houses of farmers or blue-collar workers, and they're just located one next to the other. That's very important. You can learn about it by combining the census and looking at aerial photos and maps. In Sujaiya, on the other hand, we noticed that 80% of the neighborhood is a very rural neighborhood. Fields in between, houses are built from mud brick, and most of the people, as I said, dealt with agriculture. So even though they lived supposedly in the city, they were still farmers.
And I really want to talk about now chapter 3 that deals with the question of agricultural work. And so I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the relationship between Gaza and the rural population. Can you speak a bit about, this rural population that often has been neglected, whether because of lack of sources or interest?
Right. So as I said, there were about 60 villages around Gaza in the Kazao, in the sub-district of Gaza. That's a huge population. It was a diverse population. For example, many in those villages were of Egyptian origin and settled there in the 19th century. Others were of Bedouin background who permanently settled. And that's basically the agricultural hinterland of Gaza, and they depended on the city for the city and its elite for their existence. But the interesting part is that they're really involved in Gaza's politics. I mean, in the bitter struggle between two different coalitions in Gaza, those rural groups were involved to an interesting extent. And those two coalitions try to enlist support among the villagers. They often solicited villagers to submit petitions against the other coalition. And the most interesting text that we found about this involvement is, we call it the dialogue. It's a publication that we made 2 years ago at the University of Bonn. And basically it's text of 8 pages that were sent by the Husseini family in Gaza, by supporters of the Husseini family in Gaza, to Istanbul. It's like an imagined dialogue between several people about the Husseini family. And within this text, there are numerous accusations against the rivals of the Husseini in Gaza, that they try to convince the Bedouins to rebel against the Ottoman Empire, or that they take advantage of the rural population, they mistreat it, they take a very high amount of taxes from it, they take their land, they cheat them. So we see that even though it's an imaginary text, we see that still there is a basis of reality in it, and we see that the issue of the relationship between the Gazan elite and the rural population was an important issue, and apparently both sides thought that it's really important to keep those relationships with the rural population. The background for all of this is, again, the location of Gaza next to the Egyptian border, and the fears among Abdul Hamid, or among the Ottoman elite, that the British are steering controversies in this region in order to, as a pretext for their to take control over this region. So in this atmosphere, the whole issue of the relationship with both the rural population and the Bedouins was very controversial and very delicate in terms of how the Ottomans or the Ottoman elite and the Sultan perceived it.
Now, you mentioned the Bedouins, so I'm very curious about this group of people? Because in general, there's a lot of stigma attached to them. And yet, from your narrative, it is clear that they played a major role in Gaza politics. And so I was wondering if you can briefly elaborate on their role.
So, as I said, Bedouins submitted petitions, sometimes alone, but oftentimes you can feel that one of the coalitions in Gaza, in the city, solicited those petitions or convinced them to complain against their rivals in Gaza. We see marriages ties with Bedouins. That's very surprising. We even see one member of the Hussein family, of the leading family in Gaza, marrying a Bedouin woman. We see Bedouins buy property in the city and actually even settle them there. We see a lot of Bedouins going to the Sharia court to register land or to conduct various transactions or complaining about certain things. We see a lot of involvement by the Bedouins in trade of barley through Gaza, through the little port in Gaza. They were both cultivators of barley in the northern Negev and also involved in transporting it to the port. So Bedouins we also saw their involvement in this dialogue that I mentioned. So Bedouins were really involved in Gazan politics, in Gazan society, economy, and this image of the settled people and the Bedouins who doesn't get along with each other, who constantly fight against each other. In the case of Gaza, it's very different. It's not that we don't find petitions in Istanbul against Bedouins, against attacks by Bedouins or robberies or stuff like this. But in general, the picture is much more complicated and much more, it needs to be looked at much more carefully, I would say.
Now, through the chapter, you then talk about identities. And I think identity is an important issue because we know this is the age of identity building. So can you talk about the shape and form of this identity and how it related to perhaps other local identities? You know, Gaza has its own identity, Jerusalem its own, and so forth.
So we see in the region of Gaza a lot of visiting of local shrines by the population in Gaza and the villages around the city, local festivals. We see the influence of the Gazan elite on the rural population. That's a very important issue, the involvement of the rural population in the stormy politics of Gaza. We see Gaza as a center of economic activity for the whole region of Gaza. We see some Sufi tariqas in the region that are operating in the region. We know that the Ottoman reforms in the second half of the 19th century, which made Gaza the center of a kaza, of administrative unit, turned Gaza into a much more important center for the local communities around it and enhanced the local connections and local identity of the population. And we think that there was a regional local identity in this region. And if we compare it to the literature, we know from the literature that several identities were often held by the population during the late Ottoman period in Palestine, and there were no contradictions. Those identities were held simultaneously without any problems, without any contradictions. So we stress in the book that local identity of the Gaza region was one of those identities that people held simultaneously. And since Gaza played by its own rule, and since it was located like a little bit in the periphery of Palestine, we really think that a second thought about this local identity should be considered.
You talked about families, so I think it's worth mentioning at least the Husseini family. Can you briefly talk about families in general, but also how urban-rural relations were also based on these kind of relations?
Right. So as I said, the rivaling coalitions in Gaza tried to divide the rural area around the city into zones of influence. They solicited petitions from the villages against their rivals. As I said in the dialogue, they accused their rivals of taking advantage of the villagers or of the rural population. But at the same time, the elite of Gaza bought property in the region. They bought land in the region. Sometimes they even constructed mansions, nice mansions in the rural area of Gaza. For example, one of the Husseini members who was married to a Bedouin, as I mentioned, built a very nice mansion next to Majdal, Askelan. We also hear in the region of Gaza about the regular story about giving loans to the rural population with very high interest rates, taking over villagers' land, collecting high amounts of taxes. So the whole story exists there, but we also have this issue of politics and involvement of the rural population in the stormy waters of Gaza, in the stormy politics of Gaza. The main way to learn about it is those petitions that I mentioned, but we learn it also from other sources to complete the picture. And although it's a rural population that didn't leave much evidence behind or much written evidence behind, we can still learn about those coalitions or about those petitions and about the involvement of the rural population in politics to a nice extent. And this dialogue that I mentioned really strengthened our knowledge or our understanding of this involvement when the Husseinis accused their rivals in Gaza of taking advantage of the rural population, of mistreating them. So we actually learned that this was a big issue. This was something that both sides apparently used, a card that both sides apparently used.
Now, I want to move to the last chapter. And in this one, you push forward your analysis of the urban environment. And you also talk about the emergence of a specialized urban politics. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the concept and also explain how it worked.
So we analyzed petitions signed by the rivaling coalitions in Gaza and examined the identities of those who signed the petitions. We did so with the help of this database that we constructed based on the 1905 census. And what we see is that the Husseini family is spread, their supporters are spread all over the city. They have very strong support all over the city. Their opposition has less support. It does have support around the city, but much less than initially much less than the Husseinis. But there's a certain shift around the mid 1890s. At that time, the opposition was led by a new family, by the Shawa family. They were a family of merchants who connected together with the Busseow family. The Busseow were a family of religious people, people with religious standing. And those two families, this new coalition that opposed the Husseinis, first they were supporters of the Husseinis, but something happened in the mid-90s, and those two families went against the Husseinis, and they created a new stronghold, which was based in Sujaiya, this rural neighborhood that I mentioned. And basically, the two coalitions, the Shawas Busseis in Sujaiya and the Husseinis in Daraj, the area of Daraj, started to fight or to have a fight about who will control the road to the governmental compound in the middle of the city. So, for example, the Shawas called the street leading from Sujaiya to this compound, to the governmental compound, they called it the Shara Road. The Shara Road, based on, called after this family. On the other hand, the Husseinis in Daraj called the road leading from their houses, which were called the Mufti houses, two houses that were called the Mufti houses. Why the Mufti houses? Because as far as they thought, they were concerned, this position of Mufti was in their pocket. I mean, they controlled this position, it was theirs. And in Gaza, the one who controlled this position basically controlled the city. So they called the road leading from two houses belonging to them, which were called the Mufti houses, to the governmental compound, Sibat al-Mufti, the road of the Mufti from the Husseini family. So basically, we see how those two coalitions struggle to carve zones of influence within Gaza and to name the roads leading from their strongholds to the governmental compound after their names.
And just briefly, because you mentioned that, the narrative is very dense with names and petitions, which are really your area of expertise, showing the complexity of local politics. So I'm not going to ask you to simplify all of this, but I was wondering if you can just give us a sense of examples of factionalism.
So between the early 70s, 1870s, and the mid 90s, the two main rival coalitions in Gaza were the Husseinis. It's always the Husseinis. One of the groups is always the Husseinis. But their opponents at the time, until the Shawas and the Busseows came to power, was a family called Sakala. And those two families, or two coalitions, one crystallizing around the Husseinis and the other around Sakala, submitted petitions with numerous signatories, one against the other. So, for example, in the book, we analyzed two such petitions to a great extent. One was a pro-Sakala petition from 1892 with 60 signatures, and the other one was a pro-Husseini petition in response to the former petition with 120 signatures that was submitted about a year later. And we analyzed those two petitions. Taking advantage of the database that we created, we could actually identify a lot of those who signed those petitions, and we can actually construct the network of supporters of each family or each coalition. And we can also learn where they lived, because we know from the census that a certain family lived in Sujaiya, a certain family lived in Tufah or in other places. So we basically created the network of supporters of those two coalitions. And we see that those coalitions are mutually exclusive. We don't have anyone who signed a petition in favor of Sakala who signed a petition also in favor of the Husseinis, and vice versa. That's very interesting. And another interesting thing is that at that time, the Shawas and the Busseows still supported the Husseinis. It was only 2 years later, in the mid-90s, that for some reason the Shawas and the Shawas and the Busseows went against the Husseinis and decided to act against them. And at that time, they were actually able to topple the Husseinis and to take over the politics in the city, but that was done through a new institution that I assume we will talk about it in a minute, through the Beledia, through the municipality of Gaza.
And I really want to talk about the Beledia, because it's a very interesting institution. I mean, as I work on Jerusalem, obviously that became very important, more or less in the same period of time. And for a long time, really, historians didn't pay too much attention to these Ottoman institutions. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the Beledia, the municipality.
So we don't hear a lot about the Beledia until the late 19th century, really the last year of the century. At that time, it became the new focus of power in the city, and that was the institution that allowed the opposition to topple the Husseinis and to take over the cities. It was the Shawa family that was basically able to take over this institution, and since then to control politics in Gaza, actually for many years to come, and even in the mandate period, and to a certain extent even later, even in later years. As I said previously, the issue was who will control the position of the Mufti from the 70s until the last years of the 19th or the mid 1890s. It was who will control the position of the Mufti. And basically those who controlled this position, it was usually the Husseini family. Those who controlled it basically controlled politics in Gaza. And only at the end of the century, through the Beledia, and thanks to the fact that Abdul Hamid II, the Sultan, banished the leadership of the Husseini family to Ankara in 1898, it was only thanks to those developments that finally the opposition was able to topple the Husseinis and to take control over the city.
In the end, you describe Gaza as an Eastern Mediterranean hub in transformation. Relying on this image, can you draw some conclusions in relation to your work?
Right. So first of all, I want to say a few words why we call it a hub in transformation. Prior to the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, Gaza, as I said, was located on a major land route, and this opening of the canal changed everything overnight and turned all the trade route, the land trade route, almost obsolete. So some compensation for Gaza's struggling economy was achieved through the export of barley through the little port of Gaza. But not everybody in the city enjoyed it. And also, since it was based on cultivation of barley in the northern Negev, an area that is really exposed to droughts and other climate developments, it was very shaky. I mean, one cannot really base economy on this trade, because if you have a few years of droughts, your whole system might just collapse. And that actually happened just before World War I. So that was a major issue. We also see that some processes that other port cities in the region experienced did not happen in Gaza. We talked about the modernization, involvement of European activity, settlers, and so on. So that basically bypassed Gaza. But it was still a very important city, although we don't have a lot of research about it until today. It was very important for the rural hinterland of the city. As I said, some 60 villages, a very large city, the third or fourth largest city in Palestine, and yet nothing written about it until today. And another thing that we learn is that Gaza played by its own rules, despite the Ottoman, Egyptian, and the Jerusalemite, the elite of Jerusalemite intervention in Gaza. Still, the city played by its own rules, very unique rules, very contrast or very emotional, severe rift or shift, rift between rivaling coalitions, and very stormy and unusual politics. At the city at the end of the 19th century, if you compare it to Jaffa, to Haifa, to Beirut, even to Jerusalem, it's much more severe in Gaza. I think that Gaza still plays by its own rules today and still has very stormy politics. It is still a borderland between two strong entities. Today it's Israel and Egypt, but it's still there. Today it's largely ruined after the war, but we have to remember that Gaza was almost completely ruined after World War I and eventually was able to be rebuilt during the mandate period. So I think I have hope that Gaza will be rebuilt again, hopefully some kind of permanent ceasefire or some other agreement will be achieved there. And I really don't see any reason why Gaza will not be the Singapore of the Middle East or of the world, the new Singapore of the world. But, time will tell. It's hard to be optimistic those days, but we have to. And if we look at the past, after World War I, Gaza was in a devastated situation and was able to recuperate. And during the mandate period, it was for the first time connected to the sea. The famous Rimal neighborhood that we hear about it in the news was built in the shape of grid, very organized shape of grid that basically connected Gaza to the sea for the first time. So we do have hope that despite the very difficult circumstances right now, Gaza will have a better future than right now.
And on this note of hope, this was Yuval Ben Bassat, that together with Johann Busseow wrote Late Ottoman Gaza, an Eastern Mediterranean hub in transformation, published by Cambridge University Press in 2024. Yuval, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Roberto.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.